to the God Conclusion. I'm your host, John Leonard. Greetings, listeners. Welcome again to another episode of the God Conclusion. Today we have Don Huntington, who is the author of a book that I just read. My first question to Don is going to be about the title. I'm going to guess how to pronounce it, and you're going to tell me if I'm right or wrong. And then we'll talk about the meaning of the book and everything else. I'm going to guess, just because you're a very clever guy, and it would rhyme if the title is Bein Berean. Is that it? Because I was going, okay, I used to pronounce the word Berean or, a variety of other ways, but outstanding. And very clever title, once again. It was surprisingly funny. I didn't expect to have any humor at all in the book. And one line just absolutely slayed me. You were talking about how there are no contradictions in God's word, but limited information can make it appear so. You had a very clever use of the ellipsis where you said Judas went and hanged himself. Go and do likewise. I laugh every time I think about that. I've told several people that same line. So I want to talk to you today about your book. And I want to talk to you also about your personal life, because that to me is just as interesting as the book. And so, which would you rather start talking about first?
You're the leader. I'll go wherever you go.
Okay. I think we'll talk about your life first, because then that'll lead me into possibly a segue into talking about the book, because I'm curious as how you came to write it. I know from reading about your biography that you are a former Marine, and every time I get the opportunity, I always like to say thank you for your service. But you have served well above and beyond, in my opinion, our country, our nation, and our God by being a missionary, I believe, in Kenya.
Well, no, I never actually was the missionary. I worked with an international ministry to help spread the word and help persecuted Christians around the world.
But you were on the ground in Kenya. You weren't just doing something from over here in the United States.
But it was very short-term trips, like a week or two. When we adopted the kids, it was a month or so. But I never actually went and lived anywhere like you think of your typical missionary having done.
Well, that's one of the things that I wanted to do, was to establish that you aren't just somebody who talks the talk, you walk the walk. You, as you alluded to, you adopted children from over there. And I know from just recently watching that movie, Machine Gun Preacher, that was an area that was been very war torn, and there's been a lot of orphans that have been created by murders and terrorism and all sorts of horrific things going on. I think that you and your wife probably rescued some children from there, or were called to do that. Is that maybe a fair statement?
That's fair. A couple anyway.
Well, you did more than most people do. And I know that you also have spent time as a corrections officer in the state of Pennsylvania, serving the community yet again. That's a very dangerous job, but it also is a job where you have a unique opportunity, I think, at times to share the gospel by the way you live your life with these captive men
Right.
who,
Absolutely.
I'm sure that there was an influence. How long ago did you write your book?
Well, I was trying to think about that because I actually wrote it probably 20 years ago, but then
Oh,
I didn't know how to go about getting it published, and it kind of just sat on a shelf for quite some time. And then I want to say 3, 4 years ago, I got it back out. I went over the whole thing and updated it and found a publisher.
awesome. That's outstanding.
Because you'll see there are some references in the book to 9/11 as having just taken place in the last couple of years. So I left those references the same.
Because of that and some other, it's a book that doesn't fit into any given time period. It could have been written a couple of years ago, or as you said, back in early 2000, or even before then, because the message in the book is very strong. And I want to get into that now. You talk about the American church, and I want to say that you're critical in a very loving way. It's, a lot of your message is statements that I agree with in principle, but I'm not sure how practical they might be in reality. For example, you talk about, and rightly so, I live in the deep South where there are not just churches, there are monuments.
Right.
These buildings or auditorium size, they could house a high school football game inside of them. And you know how big football is down here in the South as
Right.
well. I mean, that there are some buildings I believe that they seat 50 or 60,000 people. I know I went
Wow.
to Andy Stanley's church one Sunday, and it was a one and done thing. But they had the audience segregated by your name, and you went into a separate auditorium. If you were A through K, you went to the left. If you were L through Z, you went to the right. And depending on which side of the room you were in, you got the live experience. Otherwise, you were watching him on a big screen television, which I said, we could do this at home. I
Right.
mean, what's the whole point of this? Now, the message that you had, the church could be smaller. We're wasting our resources. We're not putting things to good use. That you're definitely singing from the same hymnal. And
Yeah, we're giving less than 10% of church income to actual ministry work, to actual boots on the ground, feeding, clothing, housing, evangelizing, all those things. It's less than 10% of all church income because the rest of it's all buildings and salaries and utilities and advertising and those kind of things.
well, I agree that we do build churches that are too big and too impressive. There's another church here in the Atlanta area. The pastor's a guy named Jensen Franklin, and he's a pretty well known televangelist. I think he's on TV every week, and he used to do a service here in Atlanta and then fly to California and do another service out there on the same day. Just crazy stuff. But by the same token, the guy was one of the most dynamic speakers I've ever listened to. I could go and
Right.
listen to one of his sermons for an hour and be riveted. But all the
Yep.
theatrics that went along with the church service were way over the top. I think one of the Sundays that we went was an Easter Sunday service, and they had a whole production with live animals and a grave, a cave that they rolled away the stone, and they had
Right.
three characters come out that were apparently supposed to be Jesus and Moses, and I forget who the third guy was supposed to be, because I was just mesmerized. They had people on ropes and pulleys up dressed as angels hanging from the ceiling that swooped down. This was insane, over the top production. But if you just went and listened to Jensen Franklin speak, it was almost worth it, but not quite. And again, this
Well,
is one of these places that we have high schools in Atlanta that aren't as big as this church is.
well,
It's
I
huge.
would say regarding that, I want to say that our preachers are really doing the work of evangelists now. They're not being pastors. And you look at the biblical pastor was just one of the elders who is gifted to speak and to teach. And so, like this Franklin, he was probably be an outstanding evangelist to for the lost. But I feel like the pastor is more of a, well, it comes from the word pastor of taking care of the sheep in the pasture. And so it's much more than telling the sheep what to do and what not to do. It's caring for them and protecting them and nurturing them and all those things that he doesn't have time for. He can't possibly have time for tens of thousands of people. So
Oh
we
no, he's like a rock star in this church. So there's no way at all to have any type of a personal relationship with him as a pastor. That all gets farmed out to his minions, and that's one of the reasons why I never took there. It was almost like a science experiment that I was going there to observe all the pageantry and all the
right.
theatrics that went with this. And again, to hear the guy speak, because his message was tremendous. You mentioned evangelism. We went 3 different Sundays, and one of the 3 Sundays, he had an evangelist from an African church. I want to say it was an African church, but this guy came over and he had a new ministry in the Free Chapel Church, just Franklin's people. They wanted to support this guy. They gave him a check for $1 million.
No.
Just boom, dropped it on him. That impressed me. They had that kind of resources and they were willing to pony it up. I love the chapter titles, by the way.
Thank you.
The King's Son and the Traitor. That was a very good title. And God's House or Country Clubs, which was where you talked about the mega churches that were having so much in real estate and investing so much in physical buildings when we could be doing much more. And I agree with that.
I'm not even
You
talking
know,
about, I'm actually not even talking about mega churches. I'm just talking about churches because we talk about church buildings and the sign divides us. The very fact that you have a sign out there divides it because it's different from the other signs in town. And
when
don't
you
we all
say
say it's
different,
the Lord's house?
you
What's
say
that?
different from the other signs. You're talking about denominational, where one is
Right,
Lutheran, one is Methodist,
right.
and I got that too. We
It might even be different kinds of Baptists, or different kinds of Presbyterians.
Oh,
There-
absolutely. And I am on the same page with you there 100%. We are all on the same team. That includes Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Catholics, everybody
one says
who
I follow
says,
Paul, another says I follow Apollos.
yeah, exactly. Good reference to the book once again. One thing I would quibble with you about, you said our Christian nation. And I've always seen our country as a secular nation founded on Christian principles. And that's obviously fundamentally different than a purely Christian nation. And now
But
we're
you're talking about a chapter title, right? Our Christian nation, the chapter title.
correct.
Okay, within that chapter, it talks about how there is really no such thing as a Christian nation. Maybe I should have put that title in quotes.
I'm reading my notes and I
Uh-huh.
realized that I did not emphasize that it was chapter title on the King's Son and the Traitor and God's House or Country Clubs, but I had not made a specific reference on there that it was a chapter title. So I probably just misrepresented what you were saying in the chapter itself. You mentioned that you served in the military. You're very patriotic, but you're not an America first, God second person. It's God
My
first,
children
and
were
that's
taught not to pledge, not to say the
I'm
pledge. So,
really
yes, because the Bible talks about making vows. And if you pledge your allegiance, that that doesn't leave you wiggle room. You've just pledged your allegiance come what may. It's kind of like the wedding vows where it's for better or worse. So I pledged my allegiance to this country, to this nation, and then this nation goes off and goes the way of, say, Hitler and the Nazis. I've pledged. And so I will be faithful to this nation. I will observe its laws. I will do everything I can to uphold and strengthen this nation. I simply won't pledge to it. My only pledge goes to God.
see. That's why I like your book so much. Is you say things that make me think and make me say, I agree with what you're saying. Because in principle, I've always, if you said to me 2 minutes ago, you should never pledge the Pledge of Allegiance, I'd have said you're crazy.
Right.
But you're right. If you blindly pledge allegiance to anything, you're saying no matter what happens, I support this thing.
Right.
And what I'm seeing today in our country, I don't support anymore. And we're not a Christian nation. And like I said, but I misunderstood you. I was thinking that you were saying, based on my horrible notes, that our nation had been a Christian nation instead of making an allusion to a chapter title. Again, a very interesting book. You quote a lot of people that not only did I know who you were quoting, I appreciated the quote in the context. I love, for example, the Richard Wurmbrand quote,
Yeah.
where he said that we were preaching the gospel and they beat us for preaching it, and we were happy
We
to
were happy to
keep
preach
preaching
and they
it.
were happy to beat. Everybody was happy.
Everybody was happy. That is such a beautiful attitude. And I was a big fan of his growing up. I remember having, I don't think it was him, but one of his associates came to our church and spoke, and very powerful message. And I'll never forget the story of how they'd walk backwards into the country so their footprints would appear to be leading out, but they were actually
Right.
smuggling Bibles in. And that's another thing that I wanted to talk to you about. You are a Bible smuggler.
Well, I was in the early 90s or late 90s, rather, 1999 and 2000. 1999, I went into Vietnam and Laos. And in 2000, I went into Iran.
Oh my goodness.
And my wife actually went with me to Iran
Oh, well, I know
because
you're well aware you're risking death in
I'm
doing
risking
that.
nothing. My father's tougher than their father.
Amen to that. I love your perspective. I really do. I do have a serious question though, because you were talking in your book about your dad taking a bullet, and every time in the future that you had your pecan pie square, that you would have it in his memory. That made me write down the question: what is your pecan pie square recipe?
It's just a recipe I have. I'll send it to you if you'd like. It's
I'd like to
awesome.
try it, because if it earned a mention in this book, it's definitely got to be something worth eating.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
If you like pecan pie, it's about 10 times better than that.
oh yeah, yeah. I definitely like pecan. I live in Georgia. How do you not
Right.
like pecan
Right.
pie and live in
Pecans and
Georgia?
peaches.
It's like yeah, you've got to eat. But although, in fairness and honesty, the best peaches come from South Carolina now.
Is that right?
Oh yeah.
Best peaches I ever got were in Ontario, Canada. So go figure.
Oh, those are Yankee peaches. They can't even be real.
Well, they weren't technically Yankee. They were on a Iroquois Native reservation. So they were Indian peaches
Really?
or Native American, if we want to be PC, I guess.
I'm not PC at all. And I wrote this down, so I want to mention it apropos of nothing, but you also quoted St. Francis in the book, and I love the quote that you chose: preach the gospel wherever you go and use words only if necessary. That is
Right,
such great advice, because we should, by our actions, people should know that we're Christians. They
right.
shouldn't be, oh, you're going to church? You go to church? That's the wrong message, that
Well,
use their actions.
whenever I get an opportunity to give somebody a book personally, and I can autograph it, I always put in there First Thessalonians 4:11 and 12. Make it your ambition to live a quiet life, working with your hands. That to me encapsulates what Christianity is supposed to be. It's supposed to be living well, and like I said, my homiletics professor in Bible college, how does this sermon help Joe pump gas? If the sermon doesn't help the ordinary guy live his ordinary day, throw it in the garbage, start again. Keep doing it until you got one that does help Joe pump gas. And so that's Christianity isn't about that. Was the whole thing I thought about the church buildings. It wasn't that they were the mega churches really huge. It's that we get that attitude of we go to church and then we come home. Well, you are the church. You can't go to the church. You are the church. So you're in church because you are the church right where you're sitting, whether at work or whether you're out gardening in the backyard or whether you're shopping or whatever. So your life has to be service to God in all of those settings.
I agree with you again. I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but one of the reasons why we couldn't do this morning was I had an obligation, and it's just to pick up some bread and take it over to a food kitchen. It's something that I enjoy doing as much or more as going to church. My biggest concern in this whole thing is that when I get on the road in Atlanta traffic, there is an imminent danger that some word's going to come out of my mouth that shouldn't have, when somebody does something that's not the most intelligent decision that you should make while you're operating a motor vehicle.
Right.
And that's why I don't put any symbols on the back of my chart car to advertise my Christianity. It's because I know I sometimes
Right.
get mad, and sometimes I really want to wave at people and not use all my fingers. And
Yeah. There's a
it,
song that's one of my wife's favorite songs, and I forget the name of it and I forget the actual words, but basically the line is that you are going to you are going to influence people all the time, every day. Sometimes it's going to be good and sometimes it's going to be bad, but you're always going to be a mentor of sorts. You're always going to be a guide. You can either guide them to the right or you can guide them to the wrong by your actions.
again, that's true. A conversation that was happening earlier today was very similar. But I'm getting off point, and I want to talk about your living in the Amish community. How did that come to be, and what was that experience like?
Well, it was just a matter of living in a house that was surrounded by the Amish. I came up to Pennsylvania from Florida and I was staying in my grandfather's house. He had medical issues and was living in town, and there were vandals and things in that area. So I just lived in his house as a way to protect it and give me a place to stay. And all my nearest neighbors were Amish, and I got to be very close friends with quite a few Amish people. I would take them for rides, somewhere they needed to go, and I'd refuse gas money, and the next morning there'd be an apple pie or a loaf of bread on my front step.
So it's not that they can't ride in a car, it's that they just can't drive one.
It's the ownership. It's the ownership. It's the pride of having all that stuff. They recognize that all the things that society has for you are they're useful, but they're mostly temptations. And so to fight off the temptation, I was going to say when you were talking about driving in Atlanta traffic, I'm like, that's why I don't drive in the city, because I just do away with temptation. I just don't go there unless I have to.
Oh, I don't.
So that's the thing. It's like the Mennonites, some of the more new order Mennonites who are kind of related to the Amish, but the new order ones are allowed to have cars. But for a long time, I don't know now, but for a long time, the car had to be black and they had to take all the chrome work off of it. So because they
That's
didn't want
interesting.
they didn't want a car that somebody could go, wow, that's a really nice car. They wanted it just to be the transportation. So it's not a matter of those things are wrong. It's that they don't want to accumulate those kind of things in their life. So if they need a ride, they'll take a ride. They just won't own a car. There are people that make an entire living off of being Amish taxis.
Well, the Amish are a very interesting people, and when they tend to get publicity, it tends to be the type where they're being persecuted. For example,
Right.
the recent stories about the FDA finding this one guy all this money because he's
Right.
got the best food that you could possibly have, and he's got this private
Yeah.
club where if you're a member of his club, you can get food from him, but it's not going to have all these steroids and
Yeah. I
uh,
saw that article, or one of them.
antibiotics, and they're trying to run the guy out of business. And I imagine that he's going to win in court on the First Amendment, but it'll probably go all the way to the Supreme Court. And then he's going to have the legal fees will kill him. So
Well, it's always a matter of the government just overreaching their authority. I know people who want to sell farm fresh, free range organic eggs, but all the FDA regulations destroy the eggs before the customer ever gets them. So these people don't sell eggs, they rent chickens. And if you rent the hen, you get 6 eggs a week because you're renting that hen, so you get the eggs she produces.
excellent. There's always a way around it. But getting
Sure.
back to the book, that was one of my objections. I tried to be very fair in the book. I did review it online, and for the sake of full disclosure, I did give you 5 stars. Although it might not have shown up as my name, it might have been under my wife's because I logged in. Long story, but I logged in to buy some stuff because it was her birthday coming up. I think I was logged in as her account when I actually did the review. But at any rate, it was me. But the whole getting rid of churches as buildings, even the smaller churches, and going to in-home churches. Now, I'm a big advocate of small group settings and that kind of thing. And a weekly Bible study that I've been a member of for a while is exactly that, where it's just about 12 guys usually get together in this friend of mine's conference room in his office for about an hour once a week and just study the Bible. But if you got rid of the church buildings completely and went to home based churches, you get a lot of local jurisdictions that are not friendly to the believers. And people have had in home churches and have started getting fines and citations from the local authorities for having gatherings of too many people at one time and things of that
Well,
nature.
if the government wants to be a pain in your backside, they're going to be a pain in their backside. Look what they did for the entire COVID. They left fast food and Walmart and stuff like that open, but they prohibited any churches from gathering. So
It was insane. You could
right.
go to a protest and scream at the top of your lungs without a mask on, but at a church, you couldn't gather outside socially distanced and sing a hymn because
And
you might
they're
spit on
they're
somebody
always
else and kill them.
if you look at places like communist China, the vast majority of Christians are home based because the government doesn't much care for Christians, and especially under 18 are prohibited because they want the children. If you old people want to believe in your fantasies, go ahead, but we got the kids. And so they simply meet quietly in their homes. Now, they're a lot more people per square mile, and so they're merely walking to somebody's home. And if they get questioned, they're like, oh, it's a birthday party or whatever. Where Christians are suffering is where they're most likely to be in homes, which persecution always strengthens the church.
Well, that's kind of underscoring my point of right now, because of the First Amendment and the fact that there are so many churches already in existence, if we sold off all those properties and used that money for evangelism, that would be a good short-term thing to do, but it puts our religious freedoms at jeopardy over the long run, in my opinion, because you are at the mercy of your local jurisdictions.
Well,
Whereas,
remember also that I made a point to say that I'm not saying this is thus saith the Lord, you need to meet in homes. I'm just saying
fair point.
we're trying to become as much like the family of God as we can possibly do, as much like the first century Christians were doing. And they met together weekly and they shared meals together and they took care of each other's needs. And the pastor was a well respected older man from within the congregation, if you will, who had earned the respect of others to fill that role. He wasn't some 22-year-old kid out of Bible college from 1,000 miles away who you hired because his wife is also a musician or teaches Sunday school. We've tended to go in the wrong direction, and I think I'm not advocating for the abolition of church buildings. What I'm advocating for is let's try to be as much like a family as we can and as little like a social club as we can.
Oh, I agree with you. Like I said, I liked your book very much and agreed with the message in theory, but wasn't sure how much reality and the theory were matching. But it sounds like, from talking with you, you have a very practical approach to it. Now, there were one or two points that you made that you kind of were emphatic in the book, and I have some questions about that on a personal level. You talked about baptism by immersion, and in the section where you're talking about the church as a family, and that's a theme that you were hammering home, is that in the United States that the churches are run too much like a business and not so much like a family. And I agree that there are a lot of churches like that. And while I'm thinking about it and going back to something we were talking about earlier in the denomination wars, when my wife and I got married about 35 years ago,
That's where
she
we're at, 35 years.
that's a oh yes, amen. She was coming from a Baptist tradition and I was coming from Lutheran. So
My wife is a Lutheran.
we decided we were going to church shop and go give everybody a shot and see where we both felt the most comfortable. And I distinctly recall that on two different Sundays in downtown Roswell, there was a Methodist church on one side of the street and a Presbyterian church on the other. And they faced each other, and they were both huge churches, lots of people. When we went to the Methodist church, one of the people, I don't think it was a pastor during the sermon, but one of the lay people or something like that said, oh, if you go listen to our Presbyterians across the street, they'll tell you the total turnoff,
Right.
that you badmouth the other church rather than saying what's good about your church. You talk bad about the other church. Went to the other church saying, well, they're obviously going to be better than the first ones. They did the exact same thing.
Right.
It was like neither one of them was focused on, you know what? We really, in this case, they could have been one church,
Right.
been in one building and had multiple services, sold off the second property, and everybody's on the same page. We're all Christians.
You
But
remember my example about the soft drinks. What you had there was Coke saying, don't drink Pepsi, Pepsi sucks. And then you had Pepsi going, don't drink Coke sucks. Well, they're both pretty much the same.
sugar water.
They are the living water with some man-made chemicals added to make them more palatable.
Exactly. It's a subjective thing.
Right.
Some people like Mountain Dew the best. So, yes, I do remember your soft drink analogy. That was another clever way that you had of representing truth in your book. I was very interested by two things. You seem to be validating that the movie Footloose was right, that it's okay to dance, it's okay to have joy. And I love that message in the book.
Yeah.
But you also talked about the pagan origins of Christmas. I agree with you that Christmas has been commercialized. And I also agree with you that the day that we have chosen to celebrate Christmas was almost certainly not the day on which Jesus was.
The reason I say September is because you'll remember the Hebrews had 3 holy days that they were commanded to always observe: Pentecost, Passover, and Tabernacles. Well, Jesus died, buried, and resurrected during Passover. The birth of the church was Pentecost, and Tabernacles is a celebration of remembering of being in temporary dwellings where God came down to be in a temporary dwelling of a human body. I'm not going to make a doctrine about it, but I find it extremely likely that Jesus was born during Tabernacles.
That's a very compelling argument that you make. But you, in the book, you were talking about or how you personally don't emphasize celebrating those particular holidays, I believe. And you talked about a tradition where you had a Mexican dish for Christmas called Mexifest.
Well, Christmas Eve.
Christmas Eve. I'm sorry, that's correct.
That's right.
Mexifest, and it's kind of a joke. I thought of the Seinfeld, and I said, "Is that on Festivus?"
I don't know. Yeah, that's just a reminder of our days of poverty when my first son was born. We were so poor, the only food we had in the house was a taco mix box. And so we had we had a box of taco mix from Old El Paso or whatever on Christmas Eve, because that's what we had.
You make do with what you have. It reminds me of that movie, A Christmas Story, where
Right.
the dogs come and get the turkey and they end up in the Chinese restaurant
Right.
on Christmas Day. Everybody's got their own story, their own traditions, and that sort of thing. And I guess that's my point here is that we're celebrating Jesus, and we should technically be doing it every day, but we should make special note of his birth because that was a miraculous event, the way it's described in scriptures.
Well,
And then his death and resurrection.
and I wanted to say regarding, Christmas is, there's no mention of birthday celebrations in the Bible. So whatever, do it, don't do it. The Bible's silent, I'm silent, But I think, and it just goes along with what I was saying before, if you if your entire Christianity, your Christian life is built around what you learned from reading the New Testament or the Bible, what in the Bible would induce you to bring in a tree and decorate it? I say right in the book, I'm not saying that having a tree is wrong. I'm just saying I made a nativity set that takes up the same space as a Christmas tree would. It's like 4 foot by 4 foot and 6 foot high. And the base of it's 2 feet off the ground. All the gifts go under there. And so instead of smelling pine and thinking, oh, Christmas, my kids grew up smelling frankincense and myrrh.
That's a good point because Christmas is become a commercialized tradition where it's all about the gift giving, but that comes from the tradition of the three wise men
Right.
bringing gifts to Christ, but people lose those gifts were symbolic, that
Right.
the gold represented his royalty and the myrrh, well, the frankincense, his deity, and the myrrh, his death, because
Right.
that's an embalming type.
They were also very expensive, and so they would have financed the flight to Egypt.
True.
So they were spiritual and practical.
Very good point. And that became very necessary shortly thereafter. I was very interested that because I did not know this at all, that Easter, I'm going to pronounce it, which is
Just Easter.
Easter. Oh, it's Easter.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's spelled Eastre. And
Yeah, just
that
like they spelled theater, you know.
okay.
Theater with an R.
But is that a pagan goddess?
Yes, pagan goddess of fertility from the Druids.
Okay. Now,
And that was one of the things I had against. I actually quoted it in my book is in essentials unity and non-essentials liberty and all things love. And so anything I say that you go, oh, well, that's controversial or that could be cause a split. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to say, okay, here's another thought. There are people who live and die by the King James. It's the only English version that they'll use. Well, the King James is the one that put Easter in the New Testament, the word Easter. The word Easter doesn't occur in the original text, it's actually Passover. But by the time the King James Bible was translated, they thought, well, not a lot of people know about Passover, but they all know about Easter, so we'll just put that word in since they're the same time. And that way people have a better idea of what time of the year we were talking about.
correct me if I'm wrong, but Easter always comes on the Sunday after Passover Friday, correct?
No, it depends on the year. Sometimes they're exactly the same. Like this year, the last couple of years, they were the same week. Sometimes they're a week apart because
Okay.
I believe Passover is a lunar holiday, but I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. But
Well, I would
however
agree
it
with
works,
you that whatever day we are remembering as the day on which Christ resurrected, it should be closely attuned to Passover. It should be the Sunday after Passover,
right,
not some other day. Calling it, naming it for a pagan goddess also strikes me as something that's wrong
or
inherently.
like I made the example. Okay, well, nobody remembers that there was a pagan goddess named Easter. You know the pagan god Baal because he's in the Bible. So if you just switch the words of pagan gods to happy Baal, don't forget the real meaning of Baal, then you realize just how insidious throwing Easter in there when it's supposed to be about the resurrection of Christ, which is pretty much the history of the world's greatest day.
I don't think I'm ever going to be able to say Happy Easter again.
I can't, I don't ever. Happy
Happy
Resurrection Sunday
Resurrection.
doesn't roll off the tongue the
I
same.
mean, what I typically say is He is risen, but Happy Resurrection Day, but no more Happy Easter. That is very good to know because I understand that some Christians along the way, meaning well, tried to appropriate
Right,
pagan holidays for our own purposes, but it's not a good thing to have all of the symbolism that goes along with it carried
right,
into the Christian traditions associated with it. And the Yule tree, the Christmas tree. Now, what my family and I have done most of the time, I mean, we always have a nativity scene, but we did have a live tree when we had a tree. In the last couple of years, we just had a little small tree because the kids are gone. But
right.
I'm going to have to think about Christmas and Easter and how these holidays are celebrated because you've given me good information that makes me question some of the decisions that I've made without really even thinking about them. Just
Right.
going, well, it's part of the tradition. I knew that Santa Claus was Saint Nicholas. Once you corrupt him beyond all recognition, he was Saint Nicholas.
Right.
Now he's a jolly fat man in a red suit.
Doesn't he become a godlike character? He's omniscient, he's omnipresent, he's everywhere. He knows whether you've been good or bad, and he punishes bad and rewards good behavior. So he really is a kind of a humanistic version of Jesus that we teach our children is real.
Like you, my kids were not indoctrinated into that at very early age. They were, but we did
And
not.
I want to say for whoever watches this, like I began the book, this is not my list of my commandments. This is not my this is right and this is wrong. It's never about our faith should never be about do this, don't do that. Our faith, we have freedom in Christ, but we need to try to use. If you have somebody in your life that you really love, your life should indicate that by doing as much to please that person that you love as possible, to be as pleasing and serving of that person that you love. And so Jesus times 1,000. If you love Jesus, it's not a matter of, well, I'm allowed to do that. I don't have to do that. Whatever. It's about, and that's how we always told the kids about, like, our kids never did Halloween, period, full stop. But we never said you're not allowed to do Halloween. We discussed what it was, and we said, would that make Jesus happy? Or would it? My kids wanted to leave the light on instead of giving out candy. Preach to kids about. But that's a good way to get your windows waxed. But
Yeah, it speaks a lot of you as a parent that that's how your kids felt. You led by that example. And that's what I got from your book is your book is not preaching to people of this is the way things have to be. It's
right.
this is the way that I see things and this is what I do personally based on what I see. And I
Right. And
agree
I don't
with
even
you
want you to read my
completely
book and
about
go, hey,
not
that's a good idea. I want you to read my book
I
and go, yeah, you're right. I better go back and read the Bible with an open mind and, change what I need to change from what I read, not from what Huntington told you.
that's exactly the sentiment that I have about the book I wrote is that it's not about me, it's not about the content of my book. It's that the people that are out there that are attracted to the Facebook page, read Richard Dawkins' book, believe in the atheist worldview. I'm trying to get them to go, is there another alternative? And what might
Right.
that alternative look like? And
Right.
so then I'm going, here is scientific evidence. I do not hide the fact that I am a Christian, but I'm not proselytizing for Christianity in my
Right.
book. And you aren't proselytizing for any particular religion. I didn't see that this was Seventh day Adventist or Methodist or Presbyterian. I
Yeah.
just saw
Figure out which
Christian,
denomination.
not a clue. I'm serious. I even looked up Berean to find out what the meaning of the word was, and it's a literal reference to a geographic location where the
Right.
people
Well, it's a scriptural
more
reference
devout than their neighbors. Yes,
because they
the people.
diligently studied the scripture because they were fact checking Paul. And that's why they were considered a more noble character because they fact checked Paul. Paul told them, this is what God wants from you. This is the truth of God's word. And they're like, okay, great. That sounds wonderful. We're not going to take your word for it. We're going to go look at the scriptures and see if what you're saying holds water. And that's the entire essence of my book. The entire purpose of my book is it doesn't matter what I say. It doesn't matter what you say. It doesn't matter what your preacher said. It doesn't matter what your Sunday school teacher said. It doesn't matter what the bishop or the pope said. It doesn't matter what anybody said. Go back to the scripture, diligently study them with a completely open mind, put all that other stuff to the side, ignore it, and just read the Bible as simply as you possibly. That's why my book is about as colloquial as you can get. I don't like big words, although I just use colloquial, but I want it to be at a third grade level because I want nobody to go, what does that highfalutin spiritual Bible college word mean? I can use them. I just hate them.
I think you're overestimating the capabilities of a third grader in this modern day and age. No, back in the turn of
Well,
the century in the 1900s, a third grader could read at a high school level now. But
right,
right now in third grade, they're trying to do sexual orientation things
right.
instead
I
of
can only
teaching
do
them
what
how to
I can
read.
do. I try
But
to dumb it down, but they just try to beat me to it.
again, this is one of the reasons why I knew that I liked you before I read your book, before we had this conversation. I saw what you were posting on my Facebook page, and they were sentiments that echoed or closely mirrored how I feel about things. And
Right,
now you just gave the Christian variation of a very fundamental theme of my book. It, I'm actually quoting the first Buddha in this because, again, I'm not trying to proselytize for Christianity in my book. I
right,
just say, I am a Christian. If you are interested and you find my argument for God compelling,
right.
then you should possibly investigate my religion. But I'm not trying to push it on them because I see them as they're too far gone when I'm starting, that I've got to get them
Right.
back to the point where they're ready to read the Bible again. But
Well,
what the
that's
Buddha
it.
said,
It's hard enough to get people to believe, to accept the fact that there might be a God. Don't come at them from the Christian church kind of thing, from your organization. Just say, open your mind to the possibilities of God. Go find him.
that's exactly the point in my book
Right,
is if you read my book and you say at the end of the book, I believe that there might be some sort of God and his name might be Odin or his name might be Buddha. I don't say you're wrong. I
right,
say I think you're wrong,
right,
but I try not to belabor that because, again, I'm trying not to preach in the book. But what the Buddha had said that I thought was so fundamentally important that it was like the very first thing that you see when you read my book. It's believe nothing, no matter who said it, even if
right.
I said it, unless it agrees with your own reason and your own common sense. To me, that's wisdom that can only come to Buddha from God. I don't care that the guy called himself Buddha or Lord Siddhartha or whatever his name was. I care about what he said and how it applies to my life. And I see that in Christianity, and particularly if you don't just read the Bible, if you study it, you learn things for example, Jephthah is one of the stories that for the longest time I hated reading because it makes God look like a villain, even though God doesn't really do anything wrong. Jephthah promises to sacrifice the first living creature that walks out of his house when he comes back victorious in battle, and it's his daughter. And you and I both know God abhors human sacrifice. It's a story that I've struggled with, but to me, it validates God
Well, doesn't that
because
isn't that's one of the key verses that led me to the "Don't Say the Pledge" decision,
a very
because just like he said, whatever happens right here, this is what I'm going to do. Okay, challenge accepted. So you go in there. I pledge allegiance to this flag. Now it doesn't make a difference. You know, it might cost you your own daughter.
that's a very good point.
Of course, it doesn't make you popular.
Well, I tell you, I've really enjoyed our conversation, and I
Me too.
don't want to cut it short. I see that we've been going a little bit over an hour, but there was one I wanted to get one more memorable quote or memorable thought, I should say, because I'm not going to give a direct quote. I just kind of scribbled down the gist of what you were saying, and that was that obedience never produces love. Love produces obedience.
And I want to tell you, The interesting thing about having written the book was you've written books, so you know the process.
Yeah.
But the last chapter of my book was already written, and not by me, before I ever wrote the first word of the first chapter. I already knew that it was there. I didn't write it down ahead of time. I remember telling people I can't wait till I get to the end because that chapter is already written. And it literally took me the time that it takes to type for me to write that chapter, because that was all about love. That came directly from God. That I don't know how much of me's in the other 11 chapters, but there's none of me in the last chapter. That I finally got done with chapter 11 and I'm like, whoo, I get to do this. And I went, done. And because that's the whole thing. It isn't about our churches, our buildings, our organizations, our missions, our ministries, our doctrines, any of that stuff. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Period.
Amen.
I mean, that
Amen.
anything beyond that is just, I don't know what it is, but it's way less important than those two sentences.
I did say that I was wrapping up the interview or the conversation with the obedience quote, but we've opened up another can of worms here that before we go away, I would like to address, and that is you mentioned that in the very last chapter of your book that you didn't really do anything. It wrote itself.
Right.
And in my book, The God Conclusion, I was actually working on the novel that's going to be published next. It's going to be called Atheist Prayer. And the idea behind it is that my private detective is hired to protect be a bodyguard of sorts to an author who happens to be an atheist and has written a book that's destined to be a bestseller, and he's already getting some publicity and that sort of thing, and it leads to death threats. And so the title is a joke that the sidekick tells the private detective, I never thought you'd be the answer to an atheist prayer.
Yeah.
And I was working on that book, and the God Conclusion is something that I thought I had already written with an earlier book called Counter Argument for God. Then it occurred to me that I never really responded to Richard Dawkins point by point, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter. I never went through his book, dissected it, tore it apart, and told everybody everything that I saw that I believed was wrong with it. And I don't like comparing. I'm not worthy of comparison to Jeremiah or Paul or any of the authors of the Bible, but I understand how they were inspired by God to
Right.
write what they wrote, because I felt a same type of inspiration in writing my book. Like you said, the chapter just wrote itself. I think I wrote the God Conclusion in about a month.
Yeah.
And it just, boom. I've been working on Atheist Prayer for 3 years.
Yeah.
It's not that I have writer's block or anything. I'm in the final stages of editing now, finally. But I didn't have that same motivation because in
Right.
that book, I'll be honest, I'm out for the bucks, baby. I'm looking to make money off of that. I want to see that novel on a big screen someday. But I felt motivated, compelled, driven by God to write the God Conclusion. And I'm kind of hearing the same thing in so many words from you,
Absolutely.
that you were inspired divinely. So I think that we probably have this fellowship that is a little bit unique in
Right.
that it's a blessing. If I died tonight, I'd be happy with where I am because I got
Yeah.
that book out. And
God.
just another thing is a quick aside, kind of interesting story. The book before that, Counter Argument for God, was not as well structured, but it actually won an award and that kind of stuff.
Well,
Before it got published, my wife, who edits, she's got her own little publishing company, and
well,
so she's an editor for my book, and she started having a situation where she was getting strangled in her sleep. It was like demonic attacks
well,
that were preventing her from editing the book. And I said, we need to understand, first of all, what we're up against and recognize him for who he is. And we need to
absolutely.
deal with that accordingly. So we need to take like a 2 week break and fast
Yeah,
and pray. When I fasted and prayed, when I came out of it 2 weeks later, the book was finished in 2 weeks.
yeah,
It was like 2 weeks off and then 2 weeks of furious work, and the book's out, comes out on Easter. And like I said, it probably didn't deserve the award it won, but it did win an award. And I felt like that was my way of giving back to God
yeah,
the fruits of my labor, because I was challenged by the intellect of a guy like Richard Dawkins going on national television and
right.
saying everything that I believe is wrong, and I'm deluded for thinking that it's true. And
I'm,
so
I'm
that
looking.
that started.
I'm
Go
really
ahead.
looking forward to reading your book, and I know my oldest son will be too, because he has long bemoaned the fact that every time they put somebody up against Richard Dawkins, it's somebody he's really upset that they don't find anybody good on these debates, and it's like,
I will be excited to have feedback from your son after he's had an opportunity to read my book, because I want that's one of the audiences that I'm most interested in.
right,
Obviously, first and foremost, it's the atheist out there, but it's also the people that understand Dawkins, because I'm looking for constructive criticism.
right.
How do I make my arguments even more bulletproof?
Well, and the fact is, we didn't cover it, but the way I became a Christian was that a friend of mine and I, we were in the Marine Corps, used to love to mock,
You mocked and ridiculed Christians. I had that
and
written down somewhere and I forgot to mention it.
we did that. Sadly, it was very easy because most Christians don't really know what they believe or why they believe. They can't give an answer for the faith that is in them. So it was really very simple. We got back from that cruise, and I really liked going on the med cruise, so I applied for a transfer to the next squadron going out. And he stayed in the squadron that we were in. So then we were separated. Now I find myself 6 months later, I find myself in Beirut, Lebanon, and I'm just bored. So there was a Bible, somebody threw it in my locker, no idea who. And I decided, I'm going to go through this thing. I'm going to find some more stuff to get these silly, stupid Christians about. And God showed me who the silly one was in that whole bit. And so my key thought is always, I don't want to be without an answer. So if there's a good book like yours where where you can equip people, because they're coming out with the Richard Dawkins says, we need something to run up opposed to that, instead of going, I believe it.
And that's what I hope that people will see my planned versus unplanned universe argument as being. In my opinion, we know that the universe had an origin. Science tells us that it had an origin. We call it the Big Bang. And now what they try to say is that the Big Bang was not really the origin of the universe, but it was the point before which there were no planets, stars, galaxies, or even atoms that existed. So the universe as we know and understand it today did not exist by any practical imagine. Can't even think of the word now. Description, I guess, is the word I was looking for. And by the way, all this gets edited out
Yeah.
when I do the editing stuff. I clean it up so that it just looks like we're talking normally the whole time. Wonderful program, but Dawkins is all bluster.
Yeah.
And So when I looked at the evidence, I said, you can say that the universe is planned or unplanned because being a computer programmer, I have to see things logically as binary alternatives. Things that can be granularized down to two options because in a computer, everything is ultimately a zero or a one. You string together the zeros and ones in different orders to create new meaning, but the computer itself the only understands a zero or a one.
Well, and isn't that the evil agenda behind the non-binary person?
True.
It isn't about the girl who's wearing blue hair and getting her breast cut off. She's just a casualty of the spiritual war that's causing that to show up in our world. That's the evil one breaking down everything at its most basic level.
I agree, and I try not to get too apocryphal on the podcast or in my
Right.
writings, but I do wonder how far down the drain we are as a human race. It seems like we've reached a point of no return, so I'm wondering why we're still here.
I just this morning watched a video on AI talking about how the AI will figure into the book of Revelation.
I'm not a big fan of AI because
Right.
AI is created by people like me. And so therein lies the limitation of AI is human involvement.
Right.
Whereas you and
AI
I,
is just the evil person's excuse to do what they want. So, oh no,
exactly,
the AI did it. Yeah.
it's improved over what it was, and it will continue to get better over time, if that's the word to use, sophisticated, but it'll never replace a human being.
Yeah.
They just can't think. They
That's
can't make a computer can't make a logic leap like a human being can.
the one thing that came up several times in your posts, my comments on your posts on Facebook was I just come back to abiogenesis. If you can't show me evidence that you can get life from non-life, then everything else you say is a non-starter. And to me, humans don't understand what life is, but I do understand that it ain't it. And whatever it is that gives us life, which is the spark of God, AI doesn't have it. So AI can't be the same as us. It can just be a really powerful slave of whoever's programming it, regardless of how far
Exactly.
they try to separate themselves from it. And that's all they're trying to do, I think, with AI is they're trying to separate themselves. It's like, oh, that wasn't my programming. AI figured that out on its own. I
Well, what they're trying to do with AI is it's another variation of scaremongering. You know, going back to the 1970s, I have to date myself. I remember it was global cooling, and it's global warming, and now it's climate change, and now it's AI, and it's always one thing after another to create Armageddon in our minds that we're on the
because
brink of
the government needs
extinction.
an enemy.
Exactly. It's all to manipulate our behavior.
We're probably close to the same age. I'm 61.
I am going to be 63 here in another couple of
So
weeks.
yeah. I
So
remember the
very
war of
so
78.
now we are retired to being writers.
Well, you're a writer. I'm just a lump of clay that God had the mercy to use one time. He
Oh,
hasn't,
that's not going to be your only book, is it?
well, it's the only one so far in 20 years.
Well, if
I,
that's the
I
only
haven't,
one you ever if that's the only one you ever write, it's a very good one.
thank you. Yeah, I thought it'd be nice to write a second book, but God hasn't knocked me in the head and go, hey, here's the idea, go for it, like he did with the first
No,
one.
I understand that, and my inspiration has been kind of out of left field. Just one day, you never responded to Dawkins, and the next day, I'm writing the book, and so the inspiration will come to you, or you'll be called to do other things, but you've
Right.
already had a very full life, and I expect that it will continue to be so. We didn't really talk about the adoptions or that kind of thing, other than mentioning them in passing. But you've done so many things that walked the walk,
Yeah.
you know. And I remember when I was going to this church that's not too far from here for a number of years. They had a congregation meeting where they showed up on the board everybody's donations, but nobody knew who anybody was. And we had a lot of affluent families in that church. And there were a lot of fancy sports cars and things like
Yeah.
that. And I remember my jaw dropping when they flashed up on the screen and they said, well, only one family in this church is given $1,000 a month. And I knew who it was immediately. And I was
Yeah.
like, why? Because we've got doctors and lawyers and people driving fancy, expensive sports cars. Why is it just one family doing this? And it's not the richest family here in the church. I'm pretty sure. So I guess my point of that is that our priorities are almost hopelessly screwed up.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And even though we mean well, my my daughter, technically stepdaughter, she watched the movie The Blind Side. And everybody watches a movie and they're moved by it and they might
Right.
even take action. They might do like you did and go adopt a couple of children from Sudan. Not my daughter. She brings in whole families.
Yeah.
And so when I say that I've taken what you were saying to heart and I see how we waste money at Christmas giving each other gifts, then I look at her and she's got these 8 foster kids, I think it is, something just a ridiculous number. I go, but how do we not do for them at Christmas to celebrate? Because everybody else is getting Christmas gifts.
Right.
So if we don't give them anything, then it's like we're
Right.
cheapskates. But I
Well,
understand what you're saying. Go ahead.
we also did the gifts. We just put them under the nativity instead of under a tree. We all we did was replace the tree with a nativity.
Yeah, that's perfect solution. Perfect
Yeah,
solution.
and it was
Because
nice. You don't have to
the
wait. You
whole
don't have to wait till Christmas Eve night to put them under there because the kids realize they're coming from, well, you. And so as you buy them, as you wrap them, you throw them under there, which was the story I told about my kid, my one son, who was only like 3 at the time, making this mistake of saying Santa Claus isn't real because Christmas was on Saturday. We went to church on Sunday. We were celebrating Christmas on Monday because that's the day I had off. And that 2-day pause before procrastinating of Christmas or whatever, delaying of Christmas was entirely on the 3 and 5-year-old. I said, here's the deal. Tomorrow's Christmas. We can open presents and do all that stuff, but then at 1:30, I have to go to work. We can do that. If you want to wait 2 days, I'll be home all day. And they didn't even bat an eye. They're like, we'll wait. So the reason there is no Santa Claus came up was the next day after Christmas, all the kids are like, what'd you get? What'd you get? What'd you get? My son, we didn't get it yet because we're having Christmas tomorrow. And they're like, well, how do you get Santa to wait? Well, we don't believe in Santa. So then the Sunday school teacher chastised him for telling him.
gets on your kid. And
Yeah.
that to me
And
is
my
wrong.
3-year-old said, but the 3-year-old said, but she never told that kid not to tell me there was a Santa.
You raise smart kids.
Well, God's blessings.
Amen.
And my wife's smarter than I am, so.
Well, that's the case almost every marriage, my friend.
Yeah. All men married up.
Yeah, I don't make any bones about it. I say when people say that I'm smug or acting superior, I say, look, I don't think I'm the smartest person on the internet. I'm not even the smartest person in my house.
Yeah, that's right.
It's just a fact.
That's right.
But anyway, Don, I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too.
Thank you for coming on the program. And
well, thank you for having me. I look forward to reading your book. Thank you for reading mine.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Well, I will look forward to your continued posts on the Facebook page because, like I said, I feel like we are kindred spirits.
Yeah.
Many of the answers that come from you are things that were on my mind or sentiments I agree with completely. So I enjoy it and I enjoy you.
It's become a hobby of mine.
Thank you for listening to The God Conclusion. If you like this episode, please consider subscribing to this channel. Join us again next week as we continue to seek truth. Quid est veritas.